The worst part of a school lockdown isn't always knowing that someone dangerous might be inside the building. Sometimes, it's hearing that person standing directly outside your classroom door and realizing they're asking you to let them in. I was 26 years old when this happened. I worked as an 8th grade math teacher at a middle school, and because I had been hired relatively young, I sometimes wondered whether my age would matter in an emergency. I wasn't inexperienced, but I knew there were situations where another 10 or 20 years of life might have given someone a different kind of confidence. That morning, I was teaching a normal math class. Nothing about the beginning of the lesson suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. I remember standing at the board, writing an equation while my students worked through the problem. Then the lockdown alarm sounded. There was no confusion about what it meant. Our school had different alarms for different emergencies, and every teacher and student had been taught how to respond. This particular alarm meant a real lockdown. It was not a drill. Everything changed instantly. I hurried toward the classroom door and locked it. Every classroom door in the building had a large glass panel, which meant anyone in the hallway could potentially look inside. The doors also had small blinds that could be pulled down to block the view. During a lockdown, we were supposed to cover the glass, turn off the lights, and move the students into the safest corner of the room, somewhere they would be difficult to see or hear from outside. I pulled the blinds down and switched off the lights. Everybody, get into the corner. Stay quiet. The students moved quickly. Chairs shifted softly across the floor before the room became almost completely silent. Then I noticed something I'd never seen before. The hallway lights had dimmed too, leaving only the emergency backup lighting. That was when the seriousness of the situation really began to sink in. My classroom was in the math wing, one of the sections of the school closest to the lobby. My room was among the first classrooms someone would pass after entering one of the 2 hallways leading away from the front entrance. And suddenly, being close to the lobby didn't feel convenient anymore. It felt dangerous. With the classroom dark and my students hidden in the corner, I tried to figure out what was happening outside. I used the classroom phone to call the front office. I waited for rings. Nobody answered. I hung up. At the time, I told myself there were reasonable explanations. The office might have been dealing with the emergency. Staff could have been instructed not to answer phones. Maybe everyone was already following lockdown procedures. Still, hearing nothing from the front office made the silence feel heavier. Then came the knocking. It wasn't the kind of knock someone gives when they're calmly asking to come inside. It was frantic. Someone struck the door repeatedly, almost desperately. Then a voice came from the hallway. "Please, let me in." I froze. The voice was immediately wrong. It was too deep to belong to one of my 8th grade students. If I had to guess the person's age based only on the sound, I would have said he was probably in his early 20s. I moved quietly toward the door. Through the blind, I could see the person's shadow on the other side. He knew I was there. "I can see you," he said. "I know you can hear me." Then he started pleading again. "Let me in." His voice had a strange quality to it. He sounded frightened, almost whimpering. But underneath that, I could still hear the unmistakable depth of an adult man's voice. I glanced toward my students. Some were staring at me with wide, confused eyes. Nobody spoke. I raised one hand, signaling them to stay completely silent. Then, against my better judgment, I spoke through the locked door. "Who's there?" The person answered immediately. "My name is Cody." There was a brief pause. "I'm a student. I need to get into the classroom. I don't feel safe in the halls." Something about the response made my stomach tighten. He seemed to be deliberately raising the pitch of his voice, as though he were trying to make himself sound younger. But it wasn't convincing. I knew what my students sounded like. This wasn't one of them. There was no realistic way that voice belonged to a middle schooler. I didn't unlock the door. I didn't even move closer to it. Instead, I backed away and returned to the corner with my students. For several seconds, nothing happened. The silence returned. Then the knocking started again. Only this time, it was much harder. The second round of knocking sounded different. The man wasn't simply asking anymore. The second round of knocking sounded different. The door shook. The man wasn't simply asking anymore. Then I heard the handle. He was becoming more forceful. He was trying the doorknob. The door shook slightly as he struck it. Then I heard the handle move. He was trying the doorknob. My students watched from the corner, and I could see fear spreading across their faces. I knew exactly what they were thinking because the same thought was running through my mind. What if the lock didn't hold? The man pulled at the handle again. Then came another impact against the door. Help
I
me."
kept my
His
attention on
voice
the
rose
students,
and
trying
fell
to
as he
make sure
pleaded
nobody
with us to
panicked.
let him inside.
One scream could
I
have
kept my
changed
attention on the
everything.
students,
If someone
trying to
outside
make sure
really
nobody
was armed,
panicked.
I didn't
One
know where
scream
he
could have
was,
changed
what he
everything.
intended to do,
If someone
or how
outside
close he
really
might
was
be to
armed,
entering the room.
I didn't know where he
So I kept
was,
signaling
what he
for
intended to
everyone to
do,
remain quiet.
or how close he
The
might be to
classroom
entering the
felt
room.
unnaturally
So I
small.
kept
There was
signaling
the
for
faint
everyone to
sound of
remain
breathing
quiet.
around me.
The classroom
student
felt
shifted
unnaturally
slightly,
small.
then stopped.
There was the faint
Somewhere
sound of
beyond the
breathing around
walls,
me.
there was
A
the
student
distant
shifted
hum of
slightly,
the building's
then stopped.
emergency systems.
Somewhere beyond
And
the
outside
walls,
the door,
there was the
the man
distant
kept
hum
trying.
of the building's
doorknob
emergency
rattled again.
systems.
Another
And
blow
outside
hit
the
the
door, the
Let
man
me
kept
in.
trying.
I remember
The
thinking
doorknob
that if
rattled
he really
again.
were a student,
Another blow
he
hit
should
the
have been
door.
able to
Let me
identify
in.
himself
I
in a
remember
way that
thinking
made
that if he
sense.
really were a
He could
student,
have given me
he
his
should have been
grade,
able to
his
identify
teacher's
himself
name,
in a
or
way that
something
made
else that would
sense.
have made his
He could
story
have given me
believable.
his grade,
Instead,
his
he
teacher's
had given
name,
me a name
or something
and a
else that would have
desperate
made his
explanation.
story believable.
Cody.
Instead, he had
Unsafe
given me
in
a
the
name
hallway,
and a
but the
desperate
voice didn't
explanation.
match.
Cody,
Eventually,
a student,
after several
unsafe
tense
in the
moments,
hallway,
the man
but the
stopped.
voice didn't match.
The handle became
Eventually,
still. The
after
knocking
several
faded.
tense moments,
Then there was nothing.
the man stopped.
I didn't know if he
The handle
walked
became
away,
still.
or if he was
The
simply
knocking
standing
faded.
somewhere outside
Then there was
the door,
nothing.
waiting.
I didn't know if
That
he'd walked
uncertainty
away
was
or if he was
almost
simply
worse.
standing
We
somewhere
remained
outside the
exactly where
door,
we were.
waiting.
Nobody
That
moved
uncertainty
toward the
was
door.
almost worse.
Nobody spoke.
We remained
The
exactly
lockdown
where we
continued.
were.
Minutes
Nobody
passed
moved
slowly.
toward the door.
It was difficult
Nobody
to
spoke.
tell how much time
The
had gone
lockdown
by,
continued.
because the
Minutes
classroom
passed
was dark.
slowly.
The hallway
It was
lights
difficult
were
to tell how
reduced
much
to
time had
backup
gone
lighting,
by
and
because
every
the
person in the
classroom was
room
dark.
seemed to be
The hallway
listening
lights
for the
were
slightest
reduced to
sound.
backup lighting,
Eventually,
and every
the
person in the
silence was
room
broken by
seemed to be
something we had
listening
been
for the
waiting
slightest
for.
sound.
An announcement came
Eventually,
over the
the
school
silence
system.
was broken
The
by
police
something
had
we had
searched
been
the
waiting
building.
for.
The lockdown
An
was
announcement
over.
came over the
The
school
school was
system.
considered safe.
The police had
But we
searched
still
the
didn't
building.
know why the man
The
had been
lockdown
there.
was over.
That answer
The
came
school
later.
was considered
After
safe.
the lockdown ended,
But we still
the
didn't know why
students
the
and
man had been
faculty
there.
were given
That
more
answer came
information
later.
about what
After
had
the
actually
lockdown
happened.
ended,
The
the students
person
and faculty were given more information about what had actually happened. The person outside my classroom had not been imagining the emergency. There really had been a man inside the school. According to what we were told, he was a man in his 20s with long hair that reached down to his shoulders. At some point during the incident, he had been walking through the school carrying what appeared to be a small handgun. Whether the weapon was an actual firearm or not was never confirmed. That detail bothered me, because even if it hadn't been real, nobody in that school had known that at the time. We had heard the lockdown alarm. We had watched the hallway lights dim. We had hidden in darkness while an adult man stood outside a classroom door, claiming to be a student. And I had been close enough to hear him trying to get inside. Later, we learned that the man had been caught on camera leaving the building through a back exit. That meant he hadn't simply vanished from the school. He had gotten out. Police continued searching for him. Approximately 2 hours later, they found him. By the time officers located him, he was no longer carrying the gun. That left one important question unanswered. Where was it? And had it ever been real? I never got a definitive answer. What stayed with me wasn't only the possibility that he had been armed. It was the realization that the person at my door had been close enough to interact with me directly. He had seen me through the glass. He knew I was there. He knew I could hear him. And he was trying to convince me to open the only thing separating him from a classroom full of children. I kept replaying those few minutes in my head afterward. The first knock. The shadow behind the blind. The voice trying to sound younger. My name is Cody. I'm a student. I don't feel safe in the halls. At the time, I was so nervous that I wasn't thinking as logically as I normally would have. Looking back, I realized there were things I could have done differently. The safest decision might have been not to answer the door at all. I might have avoided speaking to him entirely. But in that moment, I was a young teacher responsible for a room full of students, listening to someone desperately asking for help during a real lockdown. And I had no way of knowing what would happen next. I've thought about that incident many times since it happened. Not because I believe there was anything supernatural about it. There wasn't. That is what makes it so disturbing. There was a real person inside the school. Police were called. Cameras captured him leaving through a back exit. Officers eventually found him 2 hours later. And somewhere inside that chain of events was the man who had stood outside my classroom asking me to unlock the door. I still think about how easily the situation could have gone differently. If I had believed him when he said his name was Cody. If I had accepted the explanation that he was a frightened student. If I had unlocked the door because I thought I was helping someone. I don't know what would have happened. That is the part one can never answer. At the time, I was focused on keeping my students calm. I was watching their faces in the darkness and trying to communicate without making a sound. I was listening to the door and wondering whether the lock would hold. Outside, there was a man whose voice didn't match the story he was telling me. That small inconsistency was enough to stop me. And sometimes I wonder how close I came to ignoring it. Schools teach students and teachers what to do during emergencies for a reason. Lock the door, turn off the lights, stay quiet, hide from view, wait for authorities to declare the building safe. That day, those instructions became more than a routine procedure. They were the barrier between my classroom and whatever was happening in the hallway. The lockdown lasted roughly half an hour. 30 minutes isn't very long under normal circumstances. But sitting silently in a dark classroom while an unknown man tries to force his way inside can make every second feel much longer. Eventually, the police cleared the building. The man was gone, the students were safe, and the immediate danger was over. But there was one thought I couldn't shake. He had been standing right outside my classroom door. He had looked through the glass and knew I was there. He had asked me to open it. And if I had made one different decision in those few seconds, the story I remember today might have ended very differently. I still believe I could have handled some parts of the